Thanks for joining me here. We are in September and we're expanding on what I've come to think of as a kind of summer fall series. So, in August, we talked about these kind of three areas that parents might need to either work on, expand on, or that they may need to pull back from. So, we talked about leaning in with structure, finding your warmth, and also stepping back and trying to take care of yourself. So that's what we covered in August. And then the month before in July, we talked about leaning in with structure, specifically around action versus communication. So I think that really expanded on that leaning in with structure aspect from the August video. Today, we're going to be expanding on what it means to find your warmth and how to go about doing that. And then in October, I plan to cover more information about how to step back and really take time to care for yourself. So today we're going to be talking about finding the warmth, and we're going to start with kind of an overview of what we covered in the last video. So in the last video, I provided some possible indicators that you might be someone who needs to invest in finding your warmth. So some of the ways you might know are if you tend to have a very, very assertive, dominant parenting style. This is kind of the no BS parent. You might always have to have the last word in an argument with your kid. You might be feeling actually kind of emotionally distant from your child, perhaps due to all of the turbulence in the home or other circumstances. You might feel shame or embarrassment or anger towards your child, or some of those other really challenging and difficult emotions, which again, I talked about in the last video. Those are completely normal, but they could be an indicator that you're kind of missing that warmth that you used to have with your child. It might have been one of the situations that it's historically been hard to connect with this child due to personality clashes or behavior issues or stuff going on in your own life. So that might have been a historical challenge that you have with this kid. We also talked about whether warmth in the past has been dependent on your child's compliance. So now if your child is kind of trying to branch out and experiment in ways that are, typical for adolescents, that might be a really big challenge for you to find your warmth. And lastly, if you have kind of blown off your child's identity experimentation or been critical towards it, I think that would be a good indicator that it's time to invest some energy in reconnecting with your warmth. So we're going to take a quick overview of what I'll cover in today's video, and then we're going to go into some more details on each of these. So we're going to talk about processing and experiencing all of the disallowed emotions. Now, this is something I covered in the last video in August, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly. I'm going to talk about knowing yourself, knowing where your challenges are, where your pitfalls are, and how to mitigate those. We're going to look at how to recognize what is familiar in your child, even though you might be seeing him or her behave in ways that feel really different to you or have kind of a scripted feeling. We're going to look for what's familiar in your child. We're also going to talk about taking a more generous stance. Is there a positive way that you can look at or interpret what your child is going through, and even building some appreciation or admiration for your child? We're also going to talk about recognizing and reframing this question of indoctrination, which I think is very important. Because we can always hold the tension between two things that seem contradictory but can be true at the same time. So if you do feel like your child is saying scripted answers and they're saying things that don't seem like themselves, can you recognize that there might be a social influence factor there without necessarily kind of narrowing down your child into just this kind of automaton who's been indoctrinated, right? And then we're going to look at the difference between pity and compassion, which are two very different things. I'll touch on those. And we're going to talk about being a container for your child. So being non-reactive, as Lisa Marciano says. And we're going to kind of reference back something she said on the Gender a Wider Lens podcast when we get to that section. So we're going to start now with processing disallowed emotions. So if you have experienced rage, anger, resentment, disgust, or a whole host of other unpleasant emotions. And you believe, for whatever reason, many of us hold these beliefs, that these types of feelings are disallowed, or we're not allowed to have them, or we're not supposed to have them, or having those makes you a bad person or a bad parent, then I think it's really important to give yourself full permission to experience those emotions. Now, I covered this in more detail in the August video, and I talked about a great resource by Hilary Jacobs Hendel, which I think can assist you in this process. So I'm not going to go into it too much, but I did want to touch on why this is so important. When we have unprocessed, unpleasant emotions like anger or resentment, it makes it really hard for us to find the kind of softness and flexibility that is required when we're trying to reconnect with somebody that we love or find the warmth. So I think about these unprocessed, unpleasant emotions as being a barrier to connection and a barrier to finding the warmth. So it's a little counterintuitive that in a kind of safe way where you're not going to actually act out or take your anger out on anybody. There are all these kind of imaginative exercises that I described in the last video that you can use. It's a bit counterintuitive, right? Because I'm saying fully get in touch with all of those unpleasant emotions, find a safe way to process them, experience them, move through them, so that you can actually find a much more compassionate, softer way of relating to your child. So I would touch on that in the August video. I'd go back to that video and check it out. Next, I want to just encourage you to do some self-reflection about things that can interfere with your ability to connect and find the warmth. So, it's important to know our own vulnerabilities. When you're compromised due to work stress or not having slept enough or not having a healthy kind of routine in your life or feeling totally burned out by parenting responsibilities or work responsibilities, I want you to really think about how that impacts you. Is your marital stress having a profound impact on your emotional well-being? What happens when you're feeling stressed out about those things or when you're feeling overwhelmed by those things? Really take stock of it. Really try to ask yourself some questions and think about that. And then, how could you mitigate those pitfalls? What might you need to do in order to kind of be on the front end of those, right? And catch it before it gets out of control or before it really compromises your ability. And I would say, in regards to this, definitely stay tuned for next month's video in October, where I'm going to do a deep dive into how to step back and take care of yourself. We want to look at what is familiar in your child. Now, a lot of ROGD parents or parents with a gender questioning kids say, I don't really recognize my child. She's doing or saying things that are totally not her. This is all very new. And while, of course, there's an element here of the scripted answer or perhaps some social influence, which is normal for teenagers, I just want to say that it's not unusual for a parent to wake up one day with a 15-year-old and say, my kid is so different from what they were like when they were a kid. This is actually very normal. So there are always, nonetheless, glimpses of the familiar if you really pay close attention. So I would invite you to kind of reflect on where are the moments where you're like, oh, that's my kid. I recognize her. Or that's him. That's the son I know so well. Oftentimes parents report that this might be, on an extended kind of family vacation, for example, or during the weekend when there isn't this pressure to perform with that gender persona at school. They might see like, my kid's laughing again, she's making jokes, she's warm. All of the kind of normal family relationships that we're used to are back in these extended moments. Now, that's not always the case, but you have to evaluate for yourself, like, when do I really see my kid in a way that I recognize them, in a way that I think they're doing better or flourishing? So really pay attention to that. I know this is a little bit a strange thing to say, but I always focus on eyes. No matter what a person has done with their outward appearance or their clothes or their aesthetic, which again is a very normal, healthy part of adolescence to experiment with those things, the eyes are the same. A person's eyes don't change throughout their life. So if you're seeing your kid in a way that is really hard for you to feel connected, it's hard for you to feel familiar, or that they are familiar, I would really look into her eyes or into your son's eyes and just try to stay connected there. And it doesn't have to be something you're explicitly sharing with them. This is something for you so that you can feel like there's a recognition there and there's a familiarity there that I'm sure you often miss and long for. So I really like to focus on somebody's eyes. I would also ask you to think about what are some traits that are historically part of my kid's personality that are actually being expressed here. So, if you have, for example, the kind of kid who's always been intellectually open and curious and loves learning about new things, is that playing a role? Is that intellectual curiosity part of the reason that your child's really geeking out on new identities and labels and new ways to conceptualize gender and sexuality and all of these things? Is that a part of their personality, and is it being expressed now? Do you have maybe one of those really creative cosplay kids who's always enjoyed kind of taking on these fantastic ideas or characters? Are they writing a lot of fan fiction involving some gender bending themes? Is their creativity and their fantasy capacity part of what is drawing them into some aspects of gender here? So, social justice kids, has your kid always been really, really compassionate and thoughtful about what's right and wrong with the world? Why are certain things unfair? There's probably a really beautiful impetus behind some of the hierarchical beliefs that I'm not sure I agree with, but is there something that you recognize that's old going on here for your kid? And how can you just recognize that to help you stay connected and find that warmth? Or conversely, there are so many ways this could look, but I'm also thinking about the kids who are really intelligent and assertive, and they're kind of leader types. So if your kid is heading the school GSA, for example, those traits might have always been present. Maybe your kid was the leader of the history club or the robotics club, or maybe your kid was always, helping out the teacher because they are so good at giving presentations or something. I don't know, but there may be some traits that predated the gender thing that you can recognize so that you can kind of draw a thread between the past and the present. This is still the same child. They're just expressing these traits in different ways, some ways that may look really confusing or even troubling, but I want you to try and recognize what is familiar here with my child. I also encourage you to take a more generous stance, even towards some of the less enjoyable behavior that your child is exhibiting. So when you have a young person who, whether they're doing really well or they're actually doing poorly and they're having a lot of mental health complications, parenting an adolescent or young adult is often filled with kind of disappointing or head scratching or even worrying behavior coming from the child. This again is not atypical in this age group. So is there a more positive light that you can take to try and interpret even this behavior that you really find off-putting? So is there, for example, some kind of positive growth that they're achieving through this, right? We have to remember there is a need being served here. So they're getting something out of this identity, even if they seem to be really struggling in a lot of ways with their mental health, right? It may be a kind of avoidance strategy. It may be a protective mechanism. So can you just acknowledge within yourself if there's any kind of positive growth here? Now, we talked about avoidance. Now, that's obviously not a sustainable coping mechanism, right? But sometimes there are positive aspects of this. So, for example, if you have a kid who's always been very people-pleasy and self-conscious and shy, and finally she's speaking up for herself, maybe for the first time, and she's making requests of you guys or of teachers, It doesn't necessarily mean you have to comply with the request, because as a parent, it's still your job to determine what feels best for your child and for your family. But can you just kind of recognize and honor the positive growth that might be happening here? If a self-conscious kid who's always been so concerned about the judgment of others suddenly is starting to think, I don't care what other people say, I'm going to do what I feel is best, or I'm going to show people who I think I am, there's something positive there as well. Could have been perhaps a really lonely kid who was very isolated and finally has put themselves out there and started to connect with new friends. And yeah, maybe gender is the social currency by which they're making these new relationships happen. But there is still something to that, to put yourself out there and meet new people and try to connect with others. So is your kid socializing more or trying to be more engaged with other kids? Is it a kid who's really come out of her shell or his shell? And maybe, again, that protective mechanism is allowing this kid to experiment with more confident behaviors and being in the spotlight more, or finding a way to put aside self-consciousness in order to put themselves out there. So is coming out of their shell a positive, aspect of this, or perhaps a way that this is trying to meet a positive need? So can you actually show some appreciation for this? Now, you can appreciate these things about your child without agreeing with the specific conclusion they've drawn. So, for example, you might say to your child, I can see that ever since you've been experimenting with your identity, there's a part of you that's being much more confident. That's not the same thing as saying, I literally believe you're a boy now, but you're acknowledging the positive outcome that this experimentation may be having in your child's life. And in my opinion, that actually creates more flexibility for a young person to utilize the identity, perhaps temporarily, as a kind of life raft or a transitional period, and then let go of it when it's no longer serving them, or when they have figured out how to embody those positive traits without, relying on like a pronoun and a name, right? So I think if you can recognize and honor some of those things, it actually loosens up the conflict that often exists in a family when there's disagreement about gender. Are there things about your child's behavior that you actually admire? Sometimes, and I'll kind of borrow something that Stoic Mom has said in one of her blogs, sometimes kids hold up a mirror. So there might be things about your child's behavior that you're like, I could have never done that. I may not agree with the specific details of how my child is framing their identity, but wow, it was really brave of my kid to shave her head and go to school in a kind of conservative part of the country, for example, where like all girls have the same exact really long hair. There's something really brave about that. So I think it's really valuable to ask yourself, is there something admirable, or is there something I can actually be proud of that my child is doing, despite the fact that I'm concerned about some of the meaning or consequences involved in taking on a new identity? I also really appreciate something else that Stoic Mom has been talking about, which is gratitude. Is there anything you can be grateful for despite having simultaneous concerns or worries? So, for example, you could ask yourself, am I grateful about the following? Is my child doing well in school? Is my child, if you have an older child, financially stable? Is my child still in touch with us if they're older? Are we still in a good relational place? Are we still connected? Is my child in a healthy relationship with someone else? Are you grateful for that? Has your child made friends? People that they love spending time with and they can laugh together? Is your child really admired by his teachers, for example, and excelling academically? Is your child living somewhere safe and stable, or working, or has a job, or studying things that they really appreciate or find interesting? So are there things that you can be grateful for in your child's life while also acknowledging that you have concerns and maybe you don't agree with some of the specifics of what your child may be doing in other areas of their life. Remember, we always encourage young people, I say we, in therapy, I try to encourage young people to think of themselves as a whole person, right? We don't want gender to either be the reason or detriment to their happiness, right? It's gender can't make you happy, and gender also should not be something that ruins your life. If you're getting so obsessed with something that it ruins your life, that's not healthy. So if we're taking this whole person perspective, we can apply that here too and have a parent ask themselves, when I look at my child as a whole person, what are the things I'm grateful for? I wanted to touch on the idea of indoctrination. I'm very conscious of it in my work, and I recognize that social influence, and particularly a lot of the twisted up gender beliefs that kids are buying into, have a really profound impact on them and how they see the world. So I recognize that indoctrination happens. And I even, when speaking with Lisa Marciano, something she often says to me is, what's so special about your work, Sasha, is that you know how to work with indoctrinated kids. And some psychotherapists don't know how to do that. So I really appreciate her saying that and her recognition of that. But what I've also noticed in therapy is that if I'm actively thinking about my client as someone who's indoctrinated, and that's on the forefront of my mind, it's actually very hard to connect and to listen actively, right? Active listening, where you're really trying to engage what the other person is saying. So that can't be the framing that we use when we're talking to, working with, parenting a young gender questioning person. It cannot be the first thing you think about them. And I just like the tagline that I often hear cult experts say, nobody ever thinks they're joining a cult, right? So even if somebody is engaging in a very toxic way with a set of beliefs or a particular group that is harmful and using undue influence, the individual person is earnestly doing what they think is best at that moment for a variety of reasons, which we could cover in another place. So kids are really trying their best with the information that they have. So I invite parents to really think about this. Imagine what it would be like if you believed taking on a new identity, especially one that doesn't really feel authentic to you, like one that you really have to force, is the only way to live your best life, right? Imagine the kind of psychological and emotional distress that a young person might be under if they really believe that is what they have to do. Or imagine believing that you've discovered some secret knowledge that is unlocking this amazing true potential that you didn't have access to before because of learning about, quote, gender and gender identity, right? That is so powerful. So if we can kind of remember that this is a genuine attempt for most people to meet some kind of a need, and they believe they're doing the best that they can with the information they have, that can really help us reframe that idea of like, my child is brainwashed, right? I don't think that is a helpful framing. I think it's more helpful, for example, to say something like, my child is deeply invested in something that I believe has harmful aspects, and my child may not have grasped the gravity and the implications of this new obsession. There are also needs, however, that my child is earnestly trying to meet this way, right? So maybe I'll just kind of say that again, and you don't have to use this exact framing, but this is kind of the way I think about it. This young person is deeply invested in something that I believe has harmful aspects. And this person may not have grasped the gravity and the implications of this new obsession, but there are also legitimate needs they are trying to meet really earnestly this way. There's a difference between having pity for somebody and having compassion for somebody. And, of course, Brené Brown has talked about this in a similar way with her discussion of empathy and sympathy, but I'm thinking specifically about parents who rightfully recognize their child's vulnerabilities, right? And that can kind of tip over into a place of pity, which I think is different from compassion. And I think it's more helpful to cultivate a compassionate lens rather than a lens of pity. So pity inevitably involves a kind of judgment or like a standing above, right? And compassion puts us on the same playing field with somebody, and it's empathic. So compassion recognizes the kind of universality of that type of suffering. And pity, on the other hand, puts you in a place above. So for example, a pity statement might sound like saying, I would never have let that happen to me. Right? That's pity. That's not compassion. Compassion is, that could have been me had the circumstances been different. And so even as I say that, that creates a shift in how I feel in the kind of experiential way that those words land on me. That could have been me had the circumstances been different. And then you see things from a totally different perspective. This is really hard if a parent feels like maybe they don't have much in common with their child, or they really have always found their child to be kind of hard to connect with. But if you have a kid that's historically been, sometimes moms will say, my daughter is like my mini me, right? Then really try and put yourself in her shoes and think, this could have been me had the circumstances been different. And that changes your perspective. And I would invite parents to think about their own adolescence and really try to connect with a moment that was your most cringeworthy or your most dark, right? Seriously think about, what was the most self-destructive or confused you've ever been? And can you remember at the time what might have led you to make those choices? Or what was it like when you were going through that? Can you really remember those moments? And you had reasons why you took those specific actions or you did those specific things. And at the time, those felt like very legitimate reasons. So can you kind of connect with that? Because that is what these young people are kind of experiencing and going through. The last point I would like to touch on here is, as I described in the previous video, sometimes finding your warmth is really, really hard, and you may actually need to step away first and take care of yourself and process those disallowed feelings in order to find the warmth. But if you can't find the warmth at this moment, the next best thing is to try to offer yourself as a container for your child. And I'm borrowing this language from Lisa Marchiano. She talks about trying to remain non-active, right? Even while your child is going through all kinds of iterations of chaotic, turbulent, off-putting behavior and experiments. And whether your child is living at home and you guys interact with each other every single day, or your child is off at college or working or lives somewhere else, or even if there's an estrangement period, can you kind of offer yourself as a non-reactive container, right? This is a lot about stoicism too. I've been talking about Stoic Mom a lot. So I'm going to let Lisa explain this through a beautiful fairy tale called Tam Lin. And this clip that I'm about to play comes from our podcast episode with her. It was episode 54. We were talking about how to find a therapist for your gender questioning teen. But at the end, I asked her to tell the Tam Lin story because I find it to be so relevant for anybody who's parenting a young person who's kind of transforming into someone they don't recognize or someone that is hard to connect with and find the warmth with. So here is Lisa, and that will conclude this month's video.
The name of the story is Tam Lin, and in the story, a woman and a woman's engaged to her fiance, and he gets taken by the fairies. So she loses him, and she is desperate to get him back, and she searches out counsel, and a wise woman tells her that what she needs to do is wait until All Hallows Eve when the fairy trip is going to be riding by. She needs to kind of be in hiding along the side of the track, and then pull him from his horse. And then she has to hold on to him tight. And he's going to do all kinds of things, but you just have to hold on to him and don't let go no matter what. So she does this. She pulls him off the horse successfully, and he turns into a tiger. And then he turns into a roaring fire. And then he turns into writhing serpents. And then he turns into a dragon. And she doesn't let go. And then at the end, he transforms back into her beloved and is free from the spell of the fairies. So it is this sense of having to just be the container for all of the, am I allowed to say a 4-letter word on your podcast? All of the shit your kid is going to throw at you. And really it's this idea of kind of containment and holding. And you are the steady presence. And I know it's hard. I always say this, but I have never managed to do it. But, not to be too reactive